Good afternoon, and in the Zoom world, I should also add good morning and good evening, everyone. My name is Annalisa Ahlers, and I'm the head of the Lise Meitner Research Group China in the Global System of Science at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Professor Caroline Wagner, who will kick off a lecture series that is co-organized by the Berlin Contemporary China Network and my research group. This series, China the new superpower, which is important, will run for almost the entire academic year 2022-23, with basically one online talk or roundtable discussion per month. I assume you've all seen the program of the series, but we'll also post the link to it again in the chat. The main aim of the series, as well as of the Berlin network overall, is to discuss state-of-the-art empirical social science research on contemporary China and its global interactions. This ambition of in-depth empirical insights together with theory-based analysis is especially relevant, I would say, for the topic of the series this year. We will be looking at the rapid development of China's academic system and its domestic societal embedding, and the effects of the so-called rise of China for global science and scholarship. At the moment, we, if I can say we in Europe, in the US, say in the OECD countries, are often discussing all sorts of questions related to research collaboration with the PRC and China's rising academic might on the basis of either anecdotal evidence, impressive but quite superficial statistical data, or some very broad-brushed expectations and concerns or hopes. We would like to make a difference here and hope that the talks and discussions in this series will help us to further gauge all these fascinating new development on the basis of rigorous scientific research and analysis. Some technical information before I introduce Professor Wagner and then hand over to her. This is, as you can see, a normal Zoom meeting, which is great because it allows for a lot of interaction. But because of that, I would like to ask you to really make sure that you are muted for the duration of Professor Wagner's talk. Camera, you can decide whether you switch it on or off. There will be plenty of time at the end for Q&A, and you can post questions, comments, or simply your wish to speak in the chat at any time. I will monitor the chat and later moderate our discussion. We will record the lecture, but only the lecture part and not the Q&A part. The video will be made available on our and or the BCCN homepage later, and we'll keep you posted about that. But now, most importantly, I'm very excited to welcome and introduce Professor Caroline Wagner as our distinguished speaker today. Professor Wagner holds the chair in international affairs in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at the Ohio State University. If you want to categorize her in terms of academic disciplines and fields, I would call her a superstar scientometrician or even magician. You'll find out later. More formal labels and areas of her research would probably include public and especially science policy, as well as the study of innovation and international collaboration. Her academic or her career overall is so exciting and rich that I don't actually know where to start and how to finish in this short amount of time here. Let me just try to highlight a few things. She received a BA from Trinity College, an MA in Science, Technology, and Public Policy from George Washington University, and she did her PhD scholar profile in the chat, which I think is okay when we talk about someone who does scientometrics. But let me mention her two seminal books of 2008, The New Invisible College, Science for Development, and 2018, The Collaborative Era in Science Governing the Network. And among the uncountable articles and chapters, some of which we have particularly eagerly discussed in our reading groups here in Berlin, Returning Scientists and the Emergence of China's Science System, a co-authored article of 2020 in Science and Public Policy. What do China's scientific ambitions mean for science and the world? 2021 in Issues in Science and Technology. And Democracy, Complexity, and Science, Exploring Structural Sources of National Scientific Performance in Science and Public Policy 2021. While being a super productive and innovative scholar, Professor Wagner was also, from the start of her work life, as far as I can see, engaged in science policymaking as a practitioner and now as an advisor and consultant to the US government, working for a research center serving the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy with the RAND Corporation, for the US Congress, especially the Committee for Science, Space and Technology, as well as the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. With the US State Department, Wagner was also stationed for 2 years at the US Embassy in Seoul, South Korea, where she was reporting on technological change in Asia. And these are, as I said, just a few highlights. With her impressive background, I'm extremely happy to have her here today, not least since she's joining us in the very early morning hours on her side. And I will now stop talking. On to you, Professor Wagner. We are all very excited about today's topic and your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Annelies Ahlers, and I appreciate this opportunity to join you in discussing this fascinating topic of China's rise and how it challenges our notions of science-state relations. I appreciate the very generous introduction. Science-state relations has been kind of the core interest of mine throughout my career. So I'm very excited to talk and to hear from you as well and to follow your series as we explore this new area where I liken it to an astronomer finding a new planet, right? We have a whole new configuration based on the rise of China in science, and it gives us kind of a natural experiment to see how the rise of a new nation changes the configuration and changes our ideas about how science and the state interact. Let me put a timer on because I can get going and then lose track of where we are. So I wanted to put a timer on. I also appreciate being able to do this virtually. I think we know that we have to travel less in order to have less of an impact on the environment. So I really appreciate that too, even though we know face-to-face is very important, but it also gives us a chance to have these kinds of conversations across space. So thank you for indulging me on the virtual side. I would love to be in Berlin, and the times I've been there have always been wonderful. So I'm sorry I can't be there, but I do think it's better if we don't overtax the environment. So I want to talk today about how and why nations develop a science system and how China meets on one hand and or challenges our ideas about that on the other. And I do have some slides, and I don't want to spend too much time on slides and on numbers because the numbers are not that hard to get. You have some of the best scientometricians in the world right there at Max Planck Institute. So you can get that. But I also want to talk about what it means to join the global network, which I will spend a little bit more time on as we talk. But first, let's just do some facts. And let me see if I can get my screen to work. Yes. All right. So my outline today, I want to highlight China's successes, its rise, and discuss ways in which nations grow a science base, both in theory and in practice, and talk especially about science in the state. And this is where I look forward to comments and discussion. Let's compare some experiences that other countries have shown. Some people have offered a kind of a center periphery theory, which I'll talk about. And then there's also a network structure of global science. That's a theory out there of how science grows and changes. So I think we have this kind of challenge around the global network. I'll talk about that, and my books also address that in detail. And finally, I'll offer some reflections on the science-state relationship that we can use for discussion. So what are some facts? I think we know if we just look at the Web of Science, and we know Of course, the Web of Science is a subset of all scientific publication, but it is the most heavily curated, carefully curated list of journals that are considered kind of the gold standard in science. It has many issues and problems associated with it, but it really is the best we have. And so here we can see China's rise in percentage share of articles. And it is a showing of the rise of China's contributions in the Web of Science. And we know also China has a robust set of journals of its own internally. We have seen they have more than 3 million articles a year in 2019. And out of that 3 million articles, about 16% or nearly 500,000 articles are appearing in Web of Science journals. The ones in Web of Science journals tend to be more international, of course, because they're oftentimes written in English or at least abstracted in English. There are Chinese journals in Web of Science, and those also have been carefully chosen to represent high quality practices and norms of science. So, and these numbers are very impressive just in and of themselves. We also know, of course, that China has invested great deals of money. So this is a graph, not my own. This is not my own graph. This is an rndworldonline.com graph, but I thought it was extremely well put together because it shows the research and development spending as a percentage of GDP, which is the OECD measure of investment. And then it compares it to researchers per million population. And so we see on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, researchers per million population. And then on the x-axis, we see the investments in GDP, R&D as a percentage of GDP. So here we see that some nations invest more as a percentage of their GDP than the United States or China. I didn't graph, this is their graph. I would, if I could put the EU 27 in here, we would see the EU 27 to be similar, but similar to the United States. But we see Japan, some other small countries, Israel and Finland spend a greater percentage of GDP on R&D. And then we see the United States, the size of the bubble is reflected, is reflecting the amounts, right? And so we see that China, while still low in terms of percentages and also numbers of researchers, we see that they are spending a tremendous amount on research and development as a share. And this was in 2020, before the pandemic. So this graph was done actually thanks to Max Planck Society. Lutz Bormann, who was there at Max Planck, is of course a very well-known scientometrician, and he and I worked on an article together on China's share, and we can see the rapid growth of China. Now, remember that this is percentage share, and so that's why you see the US and EU coming down. They are actually, I mean, if you looked at gross numbers, they'd be going up, but percentage share is given over to China, all right? As China has risen its percentage shares, they are cutting, quote unquote, cutting into the US and the EU shares. And then we know, of course, and it's not reflected here, that there's a great deal of international cooperation also reflected underneath here. And so China and the US, China and EU, and EU and the United States are very much interconnected. But importantly, this is the data for this was provided again by the Max Planck Society Web of Science, but does not include Professor Bornemann in this, but this work was done together with Lin Zhang in China at Wudong University and with Lute Leidesdorf at the University of Amsterdam, in which we questioned the way in which the measure of the top 1% most highly cited work is done. This is work that's tended to be thought of as of Nobel class work, right? The Nobel class materials kind of are often reflected in the top 1% most highly cited work. And that is work that others cite in their, as a reference in their articles. So we looked at this and over this 4-year period, and what we saw that is that really China surpasses the EU in 2015, and this was also confirmed by Koen Jonkers at the JRC in Europe, that we see that China surpasses the EU, but then that's the EU 27, and then we put in the EU plus the UK, and then we can see that by 2019, China overtakes the United States in percentage, top 1%, most highly cited. This was an extremely surprising outcome of our research, and really we had to look carefully and make sure we were doing this right, but it's a matter of methodology to some extent, so there's a little bit of technicalities in here, but this was a surprising finding to us for many reasons, and we can talk about those reasons. If we want to look at China's output in science and where they are excellent and where they have greatly increased their work, these are the fields where we see the most increase in work. They do extremely well in chemistry, especially. Chemistry is really outstanding, world class by a long way. And then if we look at their social science output, also their economics and business work is very, very excellent. They're working on public health like so many. This is in 2019 before the pandemic. So you can see that there is a great deal of interest in these different things. Okay, let me come out of slides for a few minutes here and go back to just face-to-face and make it a little bit more direct here. So some of the other indicators that we look at, of course, is the numbers of universities that are listed and ranked. Top universities, we see China going from 2 universities about 10 years ago in the Shanghai rankings, and now they have 6 in the top 50, which is really, again, just an amazing accomplishment. So we see that while they still don't reach European or US levels in terms of numbers of top universities, they're moving up. The other thing we see is that recently in the Party Congress, Xi Jinping recommitted to an ambitious science policy with innovation as a primary driver of growth, was a statement straight out of his talk, and a kind of a balancing, I think, of in his talk between a self-reliance, a desire for self-reliance in science, as well as promises of continued global engagement. And this, I think, is a key question that I want to discuss today about this question of self-reliance versus global engagement or external engagement. They also have the goal, Xi Jinping stated the goal of making China an attractive place for the best scientific minds to work. And we'll come back to why that's really important for any nation that hopes to be a top scientific nation. And a plan to establish a system of national laboratories. You may know the United States has a system of national laboratories, as does France, and perhaps there are other nations that also have systems of national public laboratories. That would be an interesting comparison between different countries. And they're going to develop a series of national science projects, which is a very interesting policy action as well. Those are a mixed success. We've seen very mixed success records of national science projects. And I'd love to talk about that some other time, but that's something else that I think we have. So what I'd like to do now with the remaining time is kind of to re-examine the political, social, and cultural theories that we use to kind of understand and explain to ourselves what nations do as they invest in science and technology. I think we have some ideas that come to a great extent from observation. We can see that wealth, some level of wealth, national wealth, is required in order to have a science system. We know that education, especially the role of universities and research institutes, is extremely important to retain knowledge and disseminate it. We can see from that graph that investment in research and development is critical. And we'll talk a little bit about public versus private investment. It seems that as a science policy person myself, that science policy is an extremely important and plays a very important role in developing a science system. We similarly see that a strong state is needed. This is an important feature, and I think one, again, that I'd love to have feedback on. But we also see that reliable governance is needed. So that includes things like patenting, standards, metrology, and regulation as being really important for a robust science system. Low corruption is very important. It seems to be correlated with success. And then a demand function is very important for developing a science system. The other aspects that I think we need to question is the role of open inquiry and easy self-organization. So if we look at other recent success stories in the development of national science system, and I mean recent over maybe 50 years, so now we're taking a more of a historical overview, but South Korea, where I had the great fortune of being able to work for several years and examine their science system as they developed it, we can see a kind of a convergence of the rise of democracy and a commitment to science co-occurring in South Korea in the early and mid 1980s. In Korea, the government was a very strong player in the development of their science system. And they very much, what Alice Amsden, the Harvard historian, who did a fantastic book on the rise of Korea called Asia's Next Giant, talked about the bootstrapping of knowledge that they, in Korea, for example, allowed foreign investors to come to Korea as long as they brought with them some kind of knowledge that could be taught and then instituted in an organized way in some kind of Korean knowledge organization or system. So when, for example, when they brought sneakers, the making of trainers, sports shoes to Korea, the Koreans asked to set up an institute to study glue making. Okay, so and that was part of the commitment, right? That the foreign company had to teach them the chemistry of glue. So that is the kind of bootstrapping of knowledge that Korea did very effectively. They had a strong state. They were growing their universities and a cultural commitment to education. So in Korea, we saw a very heavy private sector investment. In fact, they were well over 60% of research and development was funded and conducted by the private sector. with the government having a strong hand. But they were also willing to engage internationally. However, they had a very small domestic market and relatively small demand function. Okay, so I think this is an important factor for us. Before South Korea, Japan, of course, had reinvigorated their science system after the Second World War. They had a tradition of science before the Second World War, and they had long commitment to an educated class in Japan. But they also had strong governance, similar to China, to Korea, sorry. But over time, they found that, and I think we observed that the universities had a very hierarchical structure that became something of a barrier to development of basic science, in that the inability, not the inability, but the social norm of not questioning one's seniors, one's chairs of departments in research universities became something of a barrier to growing basic science, in the same way that, in contrast to, I think, what Korea did, in contrast to Western European and US tradition, in which the student can question the professor and challenge that the kind of ways in which knowledge is created. So that at least has, again, the theory of why Japan has lagged somewhat in basic science. But again, like Korea, Japan had most of their research and development conducted in the private sector. A really big difference from the United States, for example, and I think also from Europe. So there's kind of this split between, I think, the Asian experience of private sector investments in research and Western commitments over time. So we have this kind of cultural context, I think, and norms of behavior that are difficult to quantify. We can only really observe them right now. At some point, we hope to find ways to quantify and study these things. But as we quantify, right, we kind of reduce some of the richness. So it's very, it's one of those aspects of studying the science system that still is a little bit challenging. And of the ways in which we think about and study science, there are many different ways of looking at it. Really, I would suggest to us that the state is perhaps the weakest among these. We try to measure national systems, and we do it in all kinds of ways. But really, the state it's very difficult to show that the state has systemic properties, right? We know that national borders really do not contain or constrain, in a lot of ways, the knowledge system, right? Knowledge flows across borders very easily. And so while we talk about the nation state, and certainly states have policies, the idea of kind of a German science, a French science, and American science is really not a proper way to attribute, right? We know that their science, I think we've rejected the idea as social scientists that science has cultural relativity in that way, right? That, you know, science has these kinds of universality to it. It has the commitment to being able to be reproduced regardless of culture. So the idea of, again, that this is German science opposed to French science is really not accepted, and can't be shown in any kinds of measures. So regions, I think regions have systemic properties and have been shown to have systemic properties in terms of local and regional economies and ecologies. And we know that national governments invest in science and technology, right? And we talked about the many ways they do that. But investigations have to be free of or seem to have to be free of bias or political determinism in order to be truly top quality, and also in order to be widely accepted, right? We can have sciences or technologies, but that are localized, right? And we do have them. Actually, I live in a state where we have a lot of, and I work at a university where we have a lot of localized science, right? We count the number of fish in the rivers, and we study the soil in our region and so on. And those kinds of science are also very important, but they're not necessarily the kind that flow across borders easily. So the other thing I think we're seeing, because of the lack of cultural relativity in our understanding, we see less interest in the individual researcher that we used to have. I think in the 60s and 70s, we had much more interest in the individual, but we have an enhanced interest in the system, right? And we know that there are systemic aspects of science that can be systematically explained by references to these social variables. And we are having a lot of fun, I think, as a community, understanding that, and that perhaps a shift towards a kind of, maybe we call it a mode to understanding of science. So let me go back to a slide here, if I can, in order to identify some of these features of systemic natures of the science system. So I think we're all in agreement that science, technology, and innovation contributes to this kind of knowledge creating and using system, right? So I would suggest that STI is a subset of the knowledge creating and using system. Here, I think we are aided by understandings given out of complex adaptive system studies, which have also grown up and I think greatly invigorated our understandings, that a large number of elements that in themselves may be simple can, as a result of interactions, create complex systems. So when elements exchange energy or information, humans exchange information. Eventually leads to some levels of social hierarchy. Am I able to be heard? My computer seems to have burped or something.
Yeah, there were some, you were frozen for a few seconds, but now it seems to be fine again.
Okay, great.
I'll tell you if it happens again.
Okay, thanks. All right, so we know that in the system, there's direct and indirect feedback and feed forward loops, right? In social systems, we have the feedback and feed forward loops, and that elements start with initial characteristics and conditions, but they have a relationship to a past dependence, and that memory becomes distributed throughout the system. So this becomes very important when we think about the question of whether you can have national self-reliance, as China seems to wish to have. And it also becomes important to us as we look to gain from what China has to offer, which is quite considerable, of course. So I'd like to now turn a little bit to talking about the global network. So I think that it has been discussed quite a bit in the literature over decades now about the national, again, we talked about the national character of some science, right? And Joseph Ben David, the sociologist, wrote in the 1970s about centers of science, and that the centers of world science move from one place to another, that they began in Italy in the 17th century, moved to England in the 18th century to France, in the 19th century to Germany, the end of the 19th, early 20th century, eventually moves to the United States after the war, right? And so this was at least a theory, a center periphery theory of how science grows and how it's related to regionality or place-based activity. So there has been that theory. What I've suggested in my book, especially my book in 2008, is that what has happened as, historically, we perhaps could make a good argument that there have been centers, physical and regional centers of science, that what has happened since, let's say, the 1960s, and especially accelerated by information technology, is the rise of a global network over and above the national systems, which has developed its own dynamic and its own influence in the science system, independent to some extent of the national systems. So if you accept my thesis then, or at least go along with me, we can see that this global network over and above the national system can be measured. And so here's one measurement of it, where we look at the question of the relationship with China. And this is a measure of referencing behavior of one of, I'm sorry, I take that back. This is a measure of co-authorships in scientific articles. And so here I think you can see in 2013 that, and again, it does not have the EU organized together. It has the EU disaggregated into individual member states. But we see the USA as indeed the center, if we're going to talk about center and periphery. The USA as the center, partly as a result of being huge compared to other nations. But we see Great Britain also having a very important part in that network. And then we see China over on the periphery in 2013. I think you can see other nations. Germany's there on the right with a large contribution as well, Canada, France, and so on. Now by 2017, I think, again, you can see just from the visual that the network has become denser, right? There's many, many more connections across the network. We still see the USA as an important center hub, really, in that network, but less important and in terms of size and connectivity. And we see China moving much more closely towards the center of this global network. So I think we see that China is joining a network, but the network, as I've said, is operating at the global level to some extent over and above the national groups. Sorry, I just wanted to see how much. Oh, I'm not doing well on time, I think. Over and above the national states, and that to some extent, at least at the global level, we have norms of behavior, norms of interaction that are set by the network itself, not set by states or even disciplines, but the global network has its own dynamic of entrance and participation, right? At the global level, you have to have something to offer in order to be accepted into the network. And that you also have to reciprocate with knowledge and information and resources in order to remain in the network. So it's slightly different from national, regional networks or cooperative agreements and arrangements. And we also have, I think, to our great benefit, many more nations investing in science and technology than we had, let's say, even in 1980. So we have many, many, many more places to draw from in terms of science capacity and contributions to the system. And so the system then, the global system, becomes a system unto itself. So now I think we can go back to this question of, oh, here's German. I thought you might like to see this German science cooperation with China in 2019. I just pulled this together for you so you could see where you're cooperating, where Germany's cooperating in participation in the global network, where we see physics, chemistry, engineering, and materials, all of the top areas of research where I think we know both Germany and China are excellent in those fields. So there's a great deal of exchange, and that's exactly what you would expect of the global network. Okay, so in other words, you're not going to cooperate with someone who's doing poor work at the global level, right? Because really, the more knowledgeable and capable you are, the more attractive you are to a global global collaborator. So I think that's what we would expect to see, and indeed we do see that. So when you look again at the global network, I think you can see this is also data from 2019, that really the United States and Europe still remains, that's the deep purple linkage there still remains the essential and most important connection here in the network, but we see, of course, a big change in linkages with China. So I don't want to spend too much time. How much more time do I have?
Yeah, you're fine. I mean, if we keep plus minus 30 minutes at the end for discussion, that should be fine. So you still have 10, 15 minutes?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, great. So what is this global network then? What we know is that if we look at article level collaborations, in general, we know, of course, that 90% of all work is collaborative, much more scientific work. Now, it's not necessarily clear that all of that work is a change in collaboration. I would suggest, and others have suggested, that science has always been collaborative. It's just been the social norm to put the name of one person on an article, and that social norm has changed. So I think we see that we're much more willing to acknowledge others who worked on scientific activities, but it's still a very interesting fact that we see this increasing what some people call teams. It's not necessarily all teaming, and it's not all collaborative either. It can be just a cooperative effort, but we know that quite significant percentages of work is international collaborative work, the disciplines with the most collaborations, similar to the German-China collaborations, physics, biology, medicine, and of course we saw a huge amount of that during the COVID period, and a close correlation between capacity and attractiveness to participate in at the global level. So there are other reasons to collaborate with different countries. For example, they have an unusual physical resource or a special database that makes them an attractive target for cooperation. But for the most part, we see that the more elite scientists are working at the global level, and that has been greatly aided by the fact that we can travel and people can meet face to face. So again, I love these networks. So I'm just going to share this network with you, 2019. This is the global network of academic collaboration. And obviously you can't read all the names. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it does show a very robust global network. This is the global network of industry collaboration, which again is very interesting to see. It's much less in terms of publication. Although, there are other ways in which industry collaborates across borders that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in published collaboration. If you just look at the top 20 nations, again, we still see the US as the dominant player there in 2019. I think we also know, at least here in the United States, we know that many people who have a US address are actually foreign nationals who come to the United States and work with people in their home country. So there's quite a significant amount of that. You can see that at the Nobel Prize level, for example, and that Nobel Prize winners in the United States are very often foreign nationals who came to the United States. So the United States remains a very open country and has been very much energized by the openness and the attractiveness of this system to smart people from all around the world. This gets back, I think, to the point I made earlier about Xi Jinping's interest and his statement about making China an attractive place for the best minds to come. And I think this is a recognition of the physicality and the need to be in close contact in order to conduct basic research. And here I think the United States is a good example of that because, first of all, we speak English, which English is the language of science right now. It was German, it was French, in the past it was Italian, but now it's English, so we're lucky. And so the second thing is that the openness, right, of the system, as well as the demand for the knowledge, greatly invigorates any country that is participating in scientific activities. So let's go back. This is another, just one more observation. And this was published, this is my work with Koen Jonkers, again from the JRC in Brussels, in which we did a long-term and in-depth correlation between openness measures and scientific impact. And here we see, and we published this in Nature, that open countries are much more likely to have excellent science. And this, again, reflects back to the China question. China has been less open in terms of willingness and ability to host foreign researchers. And they are talking much more now about self-reliance. And we can see that they are somewhat closing up, at least reducing their cooperation with the United States over the last 5-6 years. Now, there are political reasons for that. In fact, when I looked at the numbers for Germany, the science cooperation between China and Germany has continued to rise each year, while in the United States, we've seen a drop. But again, there's political reasons for that in the United States. So but we do see that as people come and go, it greatly invigorates and increases the excellence and quality of national science. So let me come back to this because I have a couple more points I just want to share. Okay. So, all right. So this brings us to our kind of core question that we have tonight, right? We can see that wealth, science, scientific investments, capabilities, and excellence are very closely correlated with leadership in science. We also see, if you look again at Joseph Ben David's observation about centers of science, that we see that military power is very closely correlated to leadership in science and technology. That provides a very robust demand function for knowledge. So we see that over time. When we look at Japan and Korea, for example, they did not have, and they do not have, the kind of military security link and demand for knowledge, let's say, that we see in Europe and in the United States. So we can say perhaps that this kind of wealth, scientific investment, and military demand has created a kind of symbolic, a symbiotic and catalytic effect that greatly enhances scientific capability. And I would suggest to us that this is part of what raises the alarm about China, that that is different from, I think, our sense about Japan or Korea, right? Because not only does China have a great and vast national market that serves as a demand function, they also have a civil military fusion policy where they are seeking to turn science towards military capacity. And I think as a very large nation presents that as a challenge. So I would suggest that the reason why we see so much concern about China's science and technology capability, at least from the United States side, is this perhaps unstated recognition that excellence in science and technology is often highly correlated to military leadership and power. The question, I think, for us is how much does the global network mediate that relationship between science, technology, and military power? If we accept that this kind of global network continues to operate over and above the national system and regional systems, it perhaps reduces the power of the state to direct outcomes. And it also asks a question about the nature of the norms of science and how we think about those norms going forward. So China has surprised us in the sense that they have grown up a science system in a rather controlled and totalitarian style government. We know a strong state's important to growth, but we are surprised that they are able to work at the frontiers, even in that kind of political structure. I think that is the surprise of China. So it challenges us, I think, to think about what it means to operate at the frontiers of science, because I think this is the other reason for alarm. There was this assumption that growing a science system would, in fact, be closely tied to political openness, right? And that is a very much of an Enlightenment idea, right? That democracy and science are coexisting social organizations, and that you must have a kind of openness and willingness to allow self-organization and free inquiry, free speech in order to have scientific excellence. And this, I think, is where we are. And what I'd hope our discussion focuses on is this question, because I think, sorry, this is the challenge that I think China presents to us. So I just have a couple of questions that I thought we could use to spur our conversation. So let me just put them up, because there are many things we don't know, I think, about where China is going. So, will China continue to support a global network? So they very much benefited from participating in this global network. The question of reciprocity becomes, I think, an issue at a highly aggregated level, not at an individual level. I think individual Chinese scientists have fully cooperated in the science system. The question is, will that be allowed or supported by the political system? Will China withdraw as they seek to build internally? And what does that mean for China's future excellence? Will geopolitical events prevent this kind of convergence? We see the terrible war in Ukraine as really disrupting the knowledge system as well as other systems. And if we see China, for example, becoming more hegemonic in its desires for regional control in Asia, it could prevent a kind of greater convergence of the knowledge system. Will China bump up against this kind of internal rigidity? like we saw in Japan? I think this is a really important question. And then finally, can the actions of science policymakers and analysts like us affect any of these outcomes? It may be that we're just studying these things and, there's really not that much we can do. But I do hope there are things we can do that would enhance greater peace and freedom and exchange of knowledge towards the greater good. So with that, I'll wrap up. And I thank you so much for listening to me yabber on for so long. But I do look forward to our conversation.